In this video, let us see what is a compiler and an interpreter. So in order for a program that is written in a high-level language to be executed on the system, first we have to translate it into machine code because our system understands only the machine language. So we cannot directly execute a program on our system. So first we have to translate it into machine language, and this machine code will be executed on the system. So the program or the software that translate high level language into machine language is known as a translator. So basically there are two types of translators, compiler and interpreter. Both are translators that translate the source code written in high level language into machine code. But the interpreter translates one statement of the program at a time into machine code. So that means the interpreter will first take the first statement, translate it to machine code, then execute that first statement. Then it takes a second statement, translate it into machine code, and then execute it. Go to the third one, translate it and execute the statement. Likewise, it goes up to the end of the program. So here the conversion happens statement by statement. Conversion and execution happens statement by statement. Python, it is an interpreted language. But in the case of compiler, the compiler scans the entire program and translates the whole of it into machine code at once. Here the compiler takes the entire program as the input, convert it into machine code, and the program starts execute only after this conversion of this machine code of the entire program. So here the compiler takes the entire program, translate it into machine code, and that machine code will be executed on the system. So here the translation happens at once. See, it is an example for compiled language. So let us see the difference between an interpreter and a compiler. So in the case of interpreter, the translation happens one statement at a time. But in the case of compiler, it takes the entire program and translates the entire program at one time. Interpreted programs are interpreted line by line every time they are run. So whenever we want to run a interpreted language, the translation should happen whenever we want to run the interpreted language, because it is statement by statement conversion. So this when we want to execute the interpreted program, it takes the first statement, it converts it into machine code, and then execute that statement, goes to the next statement, converts it, and execute that statement until the end of the program. So this happens whenever we run the program. But in the case of compiled program, we need to compile it only once. Once we have the compiled version of our program with us, we can execute it any number of times. So the compiled program does not need to be compiled every time when it is run. So we need to compile it only once, and we can execute at any time. In the case of interpreter, error is reported as soon as the first error is encountered. So whenever we encounter the first error, it is reported. The rest of the program will not be checked until the existing error is removed. But in the case of compiled program, errors are reported after the entire program is checked for syntactical and other errors. Here the translation happens for the entire program. So errors are reported only after the conversion of the entire program into machine code. In the case of interpreter, the interpreter runs the program from first line and stop execution only if encounters an error. But in the case of compiler, it does not allow a program to run until it is completely error-free. So we can execute compile the program only if it is error-free. If all the errors are corrected, then only we can execute this compiled program. But in the case of interpreter, the interpreter run the program. If there is no error in the first line, it will execute the first line, goes to the next statement. So likewise, it continues until we encounters an error. So in the case of interpreter, the execution time is slower because it needs to be interpreted every time. So the interpretation happens, the translation happens every time at the time of execution. The execution time is lower in the case of interpreter. But in the case of compiler, the execution time is faster because we need to compile it only once. Once we have the compiled version with us, there is no need for compilation again. So the execution time is faster in the case of compiler.